There is a stillness that comes just before sleep, a softening of the edges of the world, and it is in that tender, quiet space that we invite you tonight, not simply to rest, but to remember women who have been, for far too long, spoken of only in passing. Women who are footnotes in sermons that were really about someone else. Women who are introduced by their husbands' names, defined by their children, and quietly escorted off the page before the real story, or so we are told, begins. But the real story never left them. Tonight, we are going back to the beginning, back to the dusty, ancient world of tents and altars, of desert wells and midnight visions, of women who bargained with God, outwitted kings, and held the fate of entire nations in their hands, often without anyone fully realizing it. These are the matriarchs, the founding mothers, the women at the very root of the tree. Let their stories settle into you like warm light. You don't need to hold on tightly. Simply breathe and listen. We begin with Sarah. If you have heard of her at all, you likely know her as the woman who laughed, the old woman who couldn't have children until suddenly, miraculously, she could. That is the version of Sarah that has been polished smooth by centuries of retelling, soft, obedient, a little bit comic. But the full Sarah is something more extraordinary. She is the only woman in the entire Bible whose age at death is explicitly recorded, not approximated, not implied, recorded. 127 years. The text of Genesis stops, pauses, and makes a point of telling you exactly how long she lived, an honor given to almost no one else, male or female, in all of Scripture. Think about what that means. In a world where women's lives were rarely considered worth documenting in detail, where female deaths were often passed over in a single line or not mentioned at all, the writers of Genesis found it important enough to count Sarah's years, every single one of them. But there is more. There is a moment in Sarah's story that tends to be glossed over quickly, perhaps because it makes people uncomfortable, because it does something very few passages in the entire Bible do. It shows God explicitly, directly, and without ambiguity telling a man to listen to his wife. The situation was painful and complicated. Sarah had given her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to Abraham as a second wife, as was customary in that ancient world when a primary wife had not yet borne children. Hagar conceived a son, and in the aftermath of that birth, a deep and devastating conflict arose between the two women. Sarah wanted Hagar and her son Ishmael gone. Abraham was troubled by this. He did not want to send them away. And then God spoke. And what God said was not gentle ambiguity. The text is plain. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you. Not consider Sarah's perspective. Not try to understand where Sarah is coming from. Listen to her. Do what she says. It is one of the most remarkable directives in the Old Testament, and it is spoken to a man who would become the father of three of the world's great religions. At a pivotal moment of consequence, the divine voice sided with the woman in the room. Sarah's name, too, carries a story of transformation. She was not always Sarah. She was born Sarai, a name meaning my princess, a term of endearment, intimate and personal, belonging to one household, one family, one man's world. But God renamed her, broadened her, Sarah, princess to many, a title that expands beyond the personal and into the historical. She was no longer just one man's beloved. She was a mother of nations. The renaming was not cosmetic. It was a reclassification. And she shares that distinction with almost no one else in Scripture. And then there is Hagar. If Sarah's story has been softened over the centuries, Hagar's has been flattened almost entirely. She is too often reduced to a problem to be solved, a complication in Abraham and Sarah's story, a supporting character who exits the stage so that the main plot can continue. But Hagar did something that no one else in the entire Old Testament did. She named God. She was an Egyptian woman, an enslaved woman, a person who, by every measure of her world, had no power, no standing, no voice. She had been used as a vessel for someone else's legacy, and then, when that purpose was served, she had been driven out into the desert, alone, afraid, and carrying a child. And it was there, in the wilderness, at a spring of water, that the divine met her, not in a temple, not on a mountaintop, not in a moment of collective worship. In the desert, alone, an angel spoke to her, made promises to her, told her that the son she carried would become the father of a people too numerous to count, the very language of covenant that had been spoken to Abraham himself. The same promise given to the enslaved Egyptian woman in the wilderness. And when the encounter was over, Hagar did something audacious and beautiful. She gave God a name, El-I-O-I, the God who sees me, not the God of Abraham, not the Lord of my masters, the God who sees me. It was a naming born of personal encounter, personal recognition, personal relationship. And it is the only time in the Old Testament that a human being, not a prophet, not a patriarch, not a priest, a human being names God. That human being was an enslaved African woman in the desert. Her story does not end there, either. When she and her son were later cast out a second time, sent away with nothing but bread and a skin of water, the divine did not abandon her. When the water ran out, and she laid her child under a bush because she could not bear to watch him die, and she sat at a distance and wept, she was heard. The text says God heard the boy crying, and an angel called out to Hagar from heaven, showing her a well, sustaining their lives. She was not forgotten. She was not invisible. She was seen, just as she had named. Now we move to Rebekah, and here the story becomes something almost political. Rebekah entered the narrative as a woman of remarkable initiative. When Abraham's servant came seeking a wife for Isaac, it was Rebekah who ran to the well, who offered water generously, who agreed, without hesitation and on her own authority, to leave her family and travel to a man she had never met. Her family asked if she wanted time. She said no. She was ready to go. This is not a passive woman, and her independence of spirit only deepened over time. When she was pregnant with twins and the pregnancy was agonizing, the two children struggling within her in what felt like a war, Rebekah did not simply endure it. She went directly to God with her question. She did not ask her husband to pray on her behalf. She did not go through an intermediary. She inquired of God herself, and God answered her directly, giving her a prophecy that would shape the entire arc of her family's history. 2 nations are in your womb. The older will serve the younger. She carried that prophecy for years, quietly, watching it unfold. And when the moment came, when blind, aging Isaac was about to bestow the blessing meant for the younger son on the older, Esau, Rebekah acted, swiftly, decisively, with what can only be described as a political strategist's precision. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothing. She prepared the meal. She anticipated every obstacle. When Jacob worried that his father would feel his smooth skin and discover the deception, Rebekah took the curse upon herself. "Let the blame fall on me," she said. "Just listen to me." She was not acting out of favoritism alone. She was acting as the only person in the room who remembered the prophecy, the only one who had received it, the only one who understood that the official decree being made that day was going in the wrong direction. History would vindicate her. Jacob became Israel. The nation took his name. And it was Rebekah who ensured that destiny was not quietly handed away on a blind old man's blessing in a tent. Rachel and Leah are almost always told as a love story or a rivalry. Jacob loved Rachel. He did not love Leah. They competed for him. That is the version we receive. But let us look a little more carefully. Rachel was a shepherdess, not a decorative figure waiting by a well for her story to begin. She was working. She was doing the daily, physical, economically vital labor of tending flocks in the ancient Near East, a role that required strength, knowledge of terrain and animal husbandry, the ability to navigate the outdoors alone. When Jacob first saw her, she was not adorned and waiting. She was working. And when the time came for the family to leave her father Laban's household, after years of Laban's manipulation and broken promises, Rachel acted with a cunning that is almost breathtaking. She took her father's household idols. These were not mere trinkets. In the ancient world, possession of household idols was tied to inheritance rights. She was, in a very real sense, securing her legal claim. When Laban pursued them and searched the camp furiously, Rachel sat calmly on the camel's saddle where the idols were hidden, looked her father in the eye, and told him she could not rise because she was menstruating. And he, bound by ancient custom, did not search beneath her. She had outmaneuvered him completely. And Leah, unloved Leah, always spoken of in the shadow of her more beautiful sister, Leah left a legacy that no other woman in the Bible quite matches. Her sons became 2 of the most foundational tribes of all of Israel. Levi, from whom every priest in Israel's history would descend. Judah, from whose line came the entire royal dynasty, including, at its furthest reach, the one the Gospels would call the Lion of Judah. Every time the line of David is spoken of, every time the priesthood of Israel is mentioned, the name behind it, at the very root of the root, belongs to the woman who was not loved enough. And now we come to Tamar. And Tamar's story demands we slow down, because it is one of the most astonishing stories in all of Genesis, and one of the least discussed. She had been married into the family of Judah. Her husband died. By the law of that world, the law of levirate marriage, her husband's brother was obligated to take her as a wife and continue the family line. He refused, and he too died. Judah then promised her his third son, Shelah, when the boy came of age. He never kept that promise. He was afraid. 2 sons had died. He blamed Tamar, irrationally, quietly, and simply kept his distance, while she waited in widow's garments, aging, her future evaporating, her legal rights being denied. And then Tamar acted. She heard that Judah was traveling to oversee his sheep shearing. She laid aside her widow's garments. She veiled herself. She sat at the crossroads, and Judah, not recognizing her, propositioned her, believing her to be a prostitute. She agreed, but asked for a pledge, a seal, and cord and staff, items unmistakably his, to be held until payment arrived. Payment never came. She had what she needed. When it was discovered that Tamar was pregnant, Judah's response was swift and brutal. Bring her out and burn her. The death sentence fell without a second thought. And Tamar produced the seal, the cord, and the staff. The man who had just ordered her execution looked at his own possessions and said, in front of everyone, the words that sealed her vindication forever, "She is more righteous than I, more righteous than I." The man who had withheld her legal rights, who had denied her future, who had just sentenced her to death, publicly declared her the more righteous one. And the text agreed with him. Not only did Tamar survive, she flourished. Her sons were born, and her name was written permanently into the genealogy that opens the New Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, in the official legal record of the ancestry of Jesus of Nazareth. She is there, by name, because of what she did. As we move gently toward the edge of sleep, let 2 final women from this founding generation rest in your thoughts for a moment. Asenath, an Egyptian aristocrat, the daughter of a priest. She married Joseph, the dreamer, the favorite son, the man who would save a nation from famine. We know little of her interiority, but we know this: the 2 sons she bore Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, were elevated by Jacob himself to the status of full tribal heads. They were not half-tribes. They were not asterisks. They were founding pillars of Israel. The Egyptian woman's children became 2 of the 12 foundations, and Zipporah, the Midianite wife of Moses, the woman who tends to disappear in the grand narrative of Exodus, eclipsed by burning bushes and plagues and parted seas. But there is a moment in Exodus, brief and strange and deeply significant, where God, or the divine presence, the text is deliberately ambiguous, moves against Moses with lethal intent. And before anything else can happen, before Moses can act, before anyone can intervene, it is Zipporah who moves. She performs an emergency circumcision on their son and touches the child's feet, and the danger passes. She is not given an explanation. She is not given time to deliberate. She acts with the knowledge and the swiftness of someone who understood what needed to be done, and she saved the life of the man who would become the greatest prophet in Israel's history. Without her, there is no Exodus. These are the founding mothers, not quiet women in the background of someone else's story, political actors, survivors, strategists, women who named God, argued with angels, outmaneuvered patriarchs, and wrote their names, sometimes invisibly, sometimes in plain sight, into the foundations of everything that came after. Let their names settle into the quiet with you now. Sarah, Hagar, Rebekah, Rachel, Leah, Tamar, Asnath, Zipporah. Let the weight of their stories become something soft and grounding as you rest. You are breathing slowly now. The world is growing distant and still. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Only here, only this. Rest now, and we will continue the journey together. You are still here, still breathing, still resting in that soft, unhurried space between waking and sleep. We left you with the founding mothers, the women who built the foundations of a people before anyone had fully realized what they were doing. Sarah, who was renamed by God. Hagar, who named God in return. Rebekah, who remembered the prophecy when everyone else forgot it. Tamar, who was declared more righteous than the man who tried to have her killed. Now the story moves forward. Time passes, as it always does, and the world that the matriarchs built becomes a world in crisis. A people have become enslaved. A nation groans under the weight of empire. And it is in that darkness, in the Egypt of Pharaoh, in the wilderness, in the walled cities of Canaan, in the smoke of ancient battlefields, that the next wave of women rises. Not quietly, not gently. They rise with strategy and speed, with weapons and words, with the courage to lie to a king's face, to drive a tent peg into a general's skull, to throw a millstone from a rooftop, to hide a baby in a temple and wait years for the right moment. These are the deliverers, the warriors, the rescuers. Let their stories come to you now, one by one, like candles being lit in the dark. Before Moses parts the sea, before a single plague falls on Egypt, before any of the grand machinery of the Exodus is set in motion, two women make all of it possible. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They were midwives, Hebrew women who worked in the most intimate space between life and death, attending births, catching the first breath of every new child that entered the world. And Pharaoh summoned them. The king of the most powerful empire on oath called two midwives into his presence and issued them a direct command. Every Hebrew boy born, kill him. Every girl, let her live. The order was as simple and as monstrous as that. And Shiphrah and Puah looked at the most powerful man in their world, and they said, in the language of polished, deliberate deception, that Hebrew women were simply too vigorous, too strong. They delivered their babies before a midwife could even arrive. There was nothing to be done. They lied, calmly, professionally, to a pharaoh. This was not impulsive bravery. This was not a moment of panic. This was a considered act, carried out over time, requiring them to keep their story straight, to maintain their composure in the presence of authority, to sustain the deception for long enough to matter. Scholars and theologians have called this the first recorded act of civil disobedience in human history. Not a rebellion, not an army. Two women with a lie and the nerve to maintain it. The text says that God was kind to them because of what they did. Their households were blessed. Their names were remembered. Pharaoh's name, the specific Pharaoh of the Exodus, is never given in the text. History has debated it for centuries, but the midwives who defied him, their names are written down. Shiphrah, Puah, preserved forever. But even with the midwives' defiance, Pharaoh escalated. The decree went wider. Every Hebrew newborn son was to be thrown into the Nile, and it was into that terrible decree that Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, hid him for 3 months. When hiding him became impossible, she made a small ark of papyrus, waterproofed it with bitumen and pitch, and placed her infant son in it among the reeds at the river's edge. It is a moment of devastating tenderness, a mother making the most careful, loving preparations for a separation she could not prevent. His sister, Miriam, stood at a distance to watch what would happen. And what happened was extraordinary. Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the river to bathe. She saw the basket. She sent her servant to retrieve it. She opened it, and the baby cried. And the text says simply, she took pity on him. The daughter of the man who ordered every Hebrew boy drowned in this very river reached into that river and pulled one out. She knew exactly what she was looking at. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. She was not deceived. She was not confused. She made a conscious choice to defy her father's decree, to reach across the boundary of ethnicity and power and empire, and protect a child who had every legal reason to be destroyed. And then Miriam stepped forward, this young girl who had been watching from the reeds, and with remarkable composure offered to find a Hebrew nursing woman for the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam went and brought Jochebed. Moses' own mother was hired and paid by the Egyptian royal household to nurse her own son. She held him legally. She fed him safely. She kept him in her arms, and it was Pharaoh's treasury that funded it. Jochebed had negotiated her way back to her own child using the very system that had tried to take him. Moses grew. The Exodus came. The sea parted and the army drowned, and the people stood on the other side, gasping, shaking, alive. And in that moment of collective disbelief, in the stunned silence after a miracle, Miriam moved. She took a tambourine in her hand. She began to sing, and the women of Israel followed her, tambourines in hand, and they danced. What Miriam led that day is called the Song of the Sea, and it is believed by many biblical scholars to be one of the oldest pieces of literature in the Hebrew Bible. Ancient verse, composed in a style that linguists date to some of the earliest layers of the text, and it was sung, first and most fully, by a woman. The entire nation, an entire people newly freed from generations of slavery, followed the lead of Miriam's voice. The text calls her a prophetess. It calls her by name, as a leader. She is not introduced as Moses' sister in that moment. She stands on her own. She had been watching over her brother since he was a baby in a basket. Now she was leading a nation in its first act of worship as a free people. Her voice was the first voice of liberated Israel. Generations pass, and the Israelites are no longer slaves in Egypt. Now they are on the edges of Canaan, and the land must be navigated, negotiated, and, in the brutal logic of that ancient world, taken. It is into this volatile, violent moment that Rahab appears. She lived in Jericho. She was Canaanite. The text describes her as a woman who ran an inn, a translation that has often been rendered more harshly as prostitute, though scholars debate the precise nature of her occupation. What is not debated is where she lived and what she did next. Her house was built directly into the city wall of Jericho, not near the wall, not adjacent to it, into it. This was some of the most strategically significant real estate in the entire city, a home that was simultaneously part of the city's fortification and a gateway out of it, a location that offered views, escape routes, and control. Whether by design or circumstance, Rahab occupied one of the most tactically valuable addresses in Canaan. When Israelite spies slipped into the city, they came to her. And when the king of Jericho sent soldiers to her door demanding she hand them over, she hid the men under stalks of flax drying on her roof, and sent the soldiers on a false trail out of the city. Then she sat down with the spies and negotiated. She told them what she knew, that the people of Jericho had heard what the God of Israel had done at the Red Sea, and they were terrified. She had read the geopolitical situation correctly. She understood that the walls of Jericho, despite their thickness, despite their reputation, were not going to hold. And rather than wait for the outcome that was coming, she extracted terms. Safety for herself, safety for her family. A scarlet thread hung from her window as a marker of protection. The spies agreed. The treaty held. When the walls of Jericho fell, and the text says they fell outward in every direction, Rahab's house in the wall was the one section left standing. Her scarlet thread kept the promise alive. She survived. She was brought out of Canaan and into Israel. She married, and her name, like Tamar's before her, appears in the Gospel of Matthew, written into the same genealogy, the same official record, the same unbroken line that leads, generation by generation, to the carpenter's son from Nazareth. A Canaanite woman who negotiated with spies is in the ancestry of Jesus. Now we come to Deborah, and with Deborah we arrive at perhaps the most extraordinary figure in this entire segment, because Deborah held a position that the Bible describes with complete plainness and without apology, and that still manages to surprise people when they encounter it directly. She was a judge of Israel, the only woman to hold that title among the 12 who are listed. And the role of judge in that era was not merely a judicial function in the narrow, modern sense. A judge was a supreme leader, a military commander, a spiritual authority, the highest office in the nation at a time when there was no king. She held court under a palm tree, a specific palm tree, named in the text as the Palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. People came to her from all over Israel to have their disputes resolved. She was the final word. And when the nation faced a military crisis, when the Canaanite general Sisera was oppressing Israel with 900 iron chariots, it was Deborah who acted. She summoned the general Barak and gave him a direct military order. Take 10,000 men to Mount Tabor. God will deliver Sisera into your hands. Barak's response is one of the most revealing moments in the entire book of Judges. He told Deborah that he would go, but only if she came with him. If she did not go, neither would he. The supreme military commander of Israel would not march his 10,000 soldiers into battle without Deborah physically present beside him. She agreed to go, but she told him plainly what this would cost him. The honor of the victory would not go to him. It would go to a woman. He accepted the terms. They went to war. Deborah is given the title that the text reserves for only the most transcendent of leaders, a mother in Israel. It is not a sentimental phrase. In the context of that world, it was a formal designation of supreme national authority. She was the one who held the people together, who gave them direction, who led them through their most dangerous hour. Under her leadership, the oppression ended. Israel had peace for 40 years. But remember what Deborah had promised Barak, that the final honor of the victory would go to a woman? Her name is Jael. Sisera, the Canaanite general, fled the battlefield on foot after his forces were routed. He ran to the tent of Jael, whose household had a peace treaty with his king. He believed he was safe. She welcomed him in. She gave him milk, warm, soporific milk, when he asked for water. She covered him with a blanket. He fell into the deep, trusting sleep of a man who believes he has found refuge. And Jael picked up a tent peg and a hammer. She drove the peg through his skull into the ground. When Barak arrived, pursuing Sisera, Jael walked out to meet him and said, simply, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." And she showed him. The Song of Deborah, which is the oldest and most poetically rich chapter in the book of Judges, praises Jael in language reserved for the most honored of heroes. Most blessed of women be Jael, the same phrase that will later be used of Mary, the mother of Jesus. A nomadic woman with a tent peg ended a war. There are others in this age of warriors who desired their moment to be remembered. Achsah, the daughter of Caleb, was given as a bride to a man who had captured a city in battle. She had been offered as a prize, but Achsah was not passive about her circumstances. She urged her new husband to ask her father for a field. And then, not satisfied with only that, she came to her father herself, riding up to him, dismounting from her donkey to make a formal petition, and asked him directly for something more, the water springs that would make the land livable. Caleb gave her both the upper springs and the lower springs. She had inherited land. She identified exactly what was missing to make that land productive, and she asked for it, clearly and without apology, from the most powerful man in her family, and she received it. In the city of Abel Beth Makkah, there was a crisis. A rebel named Sheba had fled from King David's forces and taken refuge inside the city walls. The general Joab arrived with his army and began building a siege ramp against the city. The ramp was rising. The walls would fall. The city would be destroyed. And then a woman's voice called out from the wall. She asked to speak to Joab. He came forward, and she began, before anything else, with history. Abel, she told him, was an ancient city, a city of wisdom and peace. People came here to seek answers. It was a mother city in Israel. Was he really going to destroy it? Joab told her the truth. He didn't want the city. He wanted the rebel Sheba. She told him, "His head will be thrown to you over the wall." The text does not explain exactly how she persuaded the people inside the city. It simply records that she went to them with her wisdom, and that the head of Sheba came over the wall, and that Job pulled back his army and went home. This unnamed woman, known to us only as the wise woman of Abel, had faced down one of the most feared military commanders in David's kingdom, negotiated terms in real time, organized the execution of a wanted rebel, and saved her entire city, without a name, without a title, without a single verse dedicated to her backstory. She was not the only unnamed woman to stop a war with her own hands. In the city of Thebes, the rogue king Abimelech, a man who had seized power through mass murder, was attacking. He had come to the tower where the people had taken refuge, and he was advancing on the door to set it on fire. And a woman at the top of the tower dropped a millstone on his head. The stone cracked his skull. Abimelech, realizing he was dying, ordered his armor-bearer to run him through with a sword, so that no one could say a woman had killed him. But everyone knew. The text remembered. And 2,000 years later, the moment is still recorded. An unnamed woman in a tower ended a tyrant's reign with a millstone. And finally, in the darkest moment of the royal house of Judah, when a queen named Athaliah seized power by ordering the execution of every surviving member of the royal family, one woman moved in time to stop the extinction of the line of David. Her name was Jehosheba. She was a princess, the daughter of a king, and in the chaos of that massacre, she reached into the carnage and pulled out one child, a baby, Joash, her infant nephew. She hid him and his nurse in the temple for 6 years while Athaliah sat on the throne and believed herself to have eliminated every heir. For 6 years Jehosheba kept the secret. 6 years of silence, of careful protection, of daily maintenance of the most consequential secret in the kingdom, until Joash was old enough to be presented, and the priest Jehoiada organized the coup that restored him to the throne. The line of David, the line from which the gospel writers would trace the ancestry of the Messiah, survived because a princess grabbed a baby and hid him. Let these women rest with you now as the night deepens around you. Shiphrah and Puah, who looked a Pharaoh in the eye and lied to save children they had never met. Pharaoh's daughter, who chose compassion over compliance. Jochebed, who held her son again because she was clever enough to use the empire's own resources against it. Miriam, who led a nation in its first song of freedom. Rahab, who read the winds of history and bet on the right side. Deborah, who commanded generals and judged nations. Jael, who ended a war in a tent. The wise woman of Abel, who talked an army into going home. The unnamed woman of Thebes, who stopped a tyrant with a stone. Jehosheba, who hid the future in a temple. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were the ones doing the rescuing. Let that truth settle into you, warm and steady, as your breathing slows and the world grows quiet. You are safe. You are held. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. Rest now. We will continue when you are ready. You are still here, still breathing, still resting in that deep, unhurried quiet. We have traveled far together already. We began with the founding mothers, the women who named God, remembered prophecies, and wrote their names into the roots of nations. Then we walked through an age of crisis and courage, through midwives who lied to Pharaoh and warriors who ended wars with millstones and tent pegs and hidden babies in temple corridors. Now the story moves into the courts of kings, into the gilded, dangerous world of thrones and seals and royal decrees, into the chambers where history is made not on battlefields but in whispered conversations, carefully timed entrances, and letters written in a king's name by someone who was never supposed to hold the pen. This is the world of the queens, the political masterminds, the women who understood power, its machinery, its language, its vulnerabilities, and who used that understanding with a precision that, centuries later, still takes the breath away. Let their stories come to you now, slowly, richly, like torchlight moving through a palace corridor at midnight. We begin with Bathsheba, because the version of Bathsheba that most people carry is almost certainly incomplete. She entered the narrative in one of the most morally complex stories in the entire Hebrew Bible. A king saw her from a rooftop. He sent for her. What happened next has been the subject of fierce theological and ethical debate for centuries, because the text is plain that the power between them was not equal. David was the king. She was the subject. He sent messengers. She came. A child was conceived. Her husband, Uriah, was deliberately placed in the front lines of battle to be killed. That is the beginning of the story. It is not the whole of it. What happens to Bathsheba after that beginning is a story of a woman who learned the architecture of power from the inside, who grieved and endured and observed, and who, when the moment came, moved with the precision of someone who had been planning for a long time. David was old and dying. The question of succession was not yet settled. His oldest son Adonijah had already begun positioning himself as the next king, holding feasts, gathering supporters, behaving as though the throne were already his. And Solomon, Bathsheba's son, had been promised the succession, but that promise had not yet been formalized or acted upon. Bathsheba went to the king. She entered the chamber of a dying man, and she made her case. She reminded David of his promise. She laid out the political situation with clarity. She told him what Adonijah was already doing, what it would mean for her and for Solomon if the throne passed to another, and she asked him to act. Then the prophet Nathan arrived, as arranged, to corroborate her account. It worked. David summoned his officials and gave the formal order. Solomon was anointed that same day. The succession was secured, and then Solomon became king. And Bathsheba became something that the text describes in terms that ancient readers would have understood immediately, even if modern readers sometimes miss it. She became the Gabira, the Queen Mother. In the ancient Near Eastern court, the Gabira was not a ceremonial title. It was a position of real institutional power. When Solomon saw his mother approaching, he rose from his throne to meet her. He bowed to her. He had a throne placed for her, specifically at his right hand, the right hand of the king, the position of highest honor in the entire court. The woman who had entered the story as a victim of a king's unchecked power ended it seated on her own throne at the right hand of the most celebrated king in Israel's history. His son built her that throne. The Persian court, several generations later, a different empire, and a young Jewish woman living under a name that was not her own, Her name was Hadassah, but in the Persian court, she was known as Esther. And the distinction matters because Esther's entire survival strategy was built on the management of identity. She kept her Jewish heritage a strict secret from the moment she entered the royal household. No one knew, not the other women in the court, not the officials, not the king himself, who chose her as his queen. She was a covert operative inside the most powerful court in the world, and she maintained that cover for years. The crisis, when it came, was total. A man named Haman had risen to the king's favor and had obtained a royal decree authorizing the genocide of every Jewish person in the Persian Empire. The date had been set. The order had gone out to every province. It was already law. Esther's uncle Mordecai sent word to her, "You must go to the king." And she sent back a message that is one of the most honest moments in the entire book. She could not simply walk into the king's presence. Persian law was explicit. Anyone who approached the king without being summoned, anyone, including the queen, could be put to death. Unless the king extended his golden scepter, the approach was a capital offense. She had not been summoned to the king in 30 days. Mordecai's reply became one of the most quoted passages in the book. "Perhaps you have come to your position for such a time as this." Esther's response was not impulsive bravery. She asked Mordecai to gather the Jewish community for 3 days of fasting. She and her attendants would fast as well, and then she would go. "And if I perish, I perish." 3 words, the entirety of her fear and her resolve, compressed into 3 words. She approached the king. He extended the scepter. She lived. But Esther did not immediately reveal her purpose. She was too tactically careful for that. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet, then another banquet. She created the conditions: intimacy, goodwill, the specific psychological vulnerability of a man who has been honored and feasted and made to feel generous, before she made her request. She timed her revelation with the precision of someone who understood that the how and the when were just as important as the what. When she finally spoke, naming Haman, naming the decree, naming herself as one of the people marked for death, the trap was already closed. The king was already on her side emotionally before he understood what she was asking. Haman was executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. And then Esther and Mordecai did something that sealed their place not just in Jewish scripture but in the history of political action. They co-authored royal decrees. Together, the Book of Esther is explicit. The letters, the official communications, were written in the names of both Esther the queen and Mordecai. They were sent to every province. They legally authorized the Jewish people to arm themselves and to defend their lives. A woman who had hidden her identity in a foreign court had become a co-author of imperial law. The Feast of Purim, still celebrated today, was established by Esther's decree. Her authority to establish a lasting religious observance, recorded in the text, is as formal and deliberate as any royal proclamation made by any king in the ancient world. But before we leave the Persian court entirely, we must pause for a moment on a woman who is almost always forgotten in the shadow of Esther's story. Her name was Vashti, and she was the queen before Esther. King Ahasuerus was hosting a great feast, a display of imperial wealth and power that had already lasted days. He was deep in wine. His officials and nobles surrounded him, and in that moment of drunken grandiosity, he sent for Queen Vashti to come before the assembly wearing her royal crown. The commentators across centuries have understood the implication. She was to display herself for the entertainment of a roomful of intoxicated political men. Vashti refused. She sent word back, no. The king's rage was instant and total. His advisers immediately recognized the political implications. If the queen could refuse the king in public, what would it mean for every husband in the empire? The refusal was threatening not just to one king's pride, but to the entire social order they depended upon. She was removed from her position. Her crown was given to another. She lost everything for that refusal. But she refused. History gave her successor all the glory and the story. But Vashti's act of defiance, brief, costly, without any political strategy behind it, simply a woman who would not be paraded, deserves its own moment of recognition. She said no to the most powerful man in the world. That is not a small thing. Athaliah is the only woman in the history of the divided monarchy to rule as the sole reigning monarch over the kingdom of Judah. She was a queen first as the wife of King Jehoram, then as the mother of King Ahaziah. When Ahaziah was killed, the throne was suddenly empty, and Athaliah did not wait. She moved immediately and without hesitation to seize it, ordering the execution of the remaining members of the royal household, including, by the text's account, her own grandchildren. It was Jehosheba, as we heard in our last segment, who rescued the infant Joash from that massacre. Athaliah reigned for 6 years. 6 years during which the Temple of Baal was established in Jerusalem, during which the political and religious landscape of the kingdom was dramatically reshaped. She was not a regent. She was not ruling on behalf of a son or husband. She was the monarch, and she governed as one. Her end came when Joash was old enough to be presented, and the priest Jehoiada organized the coup that restored the Davidic line. But for 6 years, the throne of Judah belonged to her alone. No other woman in that long history of kings held what she held. Then there is Jezebel. And Jezebel's story is perhaps the most complicated of all, because she has been turned, over centuries of interpretation, into an archetype of seduction and wickedness so thoroughly that the actual woman underneath the mythology is almost impossible to see clearly. But look at what the text actually shows us, and you find something far more specific than myth. Jezebel was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Sidon. She came to Israel as the wife of King Ahab, already formed, already a person of fame, religious convictions, political instincts, and complete assurance in her own authority. She worshipped Baal. She believed in that worship with the same intensity that the prophets of Yahweh believed in theirs. And she used the resources of the state to support it, funding hundreds of prophets at the royal table. She did not merely influence Ahab. The text makes clear, repeatedly, that she was the driving force in the partnership. When Elijah called out the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, it was Jezebel's prophets he was challenging. When Elijah won and had those prophets killed, it was Jezebel, not Ahab, who sent Elijah the death threat that sent him fleeing into the wilderness. And the story of Naboth's vineyard is perhaps the most precise illustration of how she operated. Ahab wanted a piece of land belonging to a man named Naboth, who refused to sell his ancestral inheritance. Ahab was sullen and defeated by this refusal. He went home and lay on his bed and refused to eat. And Jezebel looked at him and said, essentially, "Are you not the king of Israel?" She took the royal seal. She wrote letters in Ahab's name to the elders and nobles of Naboth's city. She arranged false witnesses to accuse him of blasphemy. She constructed an entire judicial process, used it to have an innocent man executed, and then told Ahab to go and take possession of the vineyard. It was a forgery. It was a conspiracy. It was a sophisticated manipulation of legal and political machinery to achieve a specific outcome, and she executed it flawlessly. History has made her name a synonym for wickedness. But what the text actually shows is a woman who understood power completely and used it without apology in the service of her own vision, her own convictions, her own agenda. The Queen of Sheba. She came from a nation to the south. Most scholars place her realm in modern Ethiopia or Yemen, or perhaps both, given that ancient Saba straddled what we now call the Red Sea. She was an independent head of state. She came with a caravan of such size and splendor that the text says it was overwhelming. Spices, gold, precious stones. And she came with questions, hard questions, things she had heard about Solomon's wisdom and wanted to test with her own mind. The text says Solomon answered every one of her questions. There was nothing too difficult for him to explain to her, and she gave him 120 talents of gold. To understand what that number means, a single talent of gold in the ancient world was approximately 34 kilograms. 120 talents was roughly 4,000 kilograms of gold. It was an astronomical sum, a diplomatic gift of such magnitude that it represented the financial output of an entire nation. She gave it freely to a man whose wisdom she had come to verify for herself. They spoke. They exchanged gifts. She saw his palace, his court, his table, the order of his servants, and she told him plainly, with what reads as the complete intellectual honesty of one sovereign to another, that what she had heard in her own country had not captured half of what she saw before her. The Queen of Sheba crossed the ancient world not to be seen, but to see, not to be impressed, but to judge. And her judgment, when it came, was generous because it was earned. And there was Abigail, a woman who had the misfortune of being married to a man the text describes simply, without embellishment, as a fool. Her husband Nabal had insulted David, who was not yet king but was already the kind of man whose insults had consequences. David was coming with 400 armed men. He intended to kill every male in the household before morning. Abigail found out before her husband did. She did not tell Nabal. She moved. She gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, grain, raisins, and fig cakes. She loaded them on donkeys. She sent servants ahead, and she rode out herself to intercept a private army. When she met David, she dismounted from her donkey and bowed before him, and then she spoke, and what she said was not a simple apology. It was a carefully constructed diplomatic speech that acknowledged his anger, accepted responsibility, reminded him of his own future legacy, and framed the restraint she was asking of him not as weakness but as wisdom. "When the Lord has fulfilled every good thing he promised you," she said, "you won't want this on your conscience, the shedding of innocent blood." She talked the future king of Israel out of a massacre. With bread and words, David told her that her good judgment had kept him from bloodshed that day. 2 final portraits before we rest. Michal, the daughter of King Saul, loved David. The text says this plainly, and in a remarkable distinction. She is the only woman in the entire Hebrew Bible described as explicitly loving a man. When Saul sent assassins to David's house, it was Michal who helped him escape through a window, who then placed a household idol in the bed and covered it to look like a sleeping man, buying David the time he needed to disappear. She risked her father's wrath. She deceived his soldiers. She saved the man she loved. And in the book of Proverbs, in the 31st chapter, there is a passage known perhaps better than almost any other in the wisdom literature. The Proverbs 31 woman. She has been held up for generations as the model of womanhood, industrious, devoted, tireless. But look at what the text actually says. She considers a field and buys it. She plants a vineyard with her own earnings. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchants. She is a real estate investor, a manufacturer, an international trader. The Hebrew word used for her character, chayil, is the same word used for military valor elsewhere in Scripture. The woman praised in Proverbs 31 is not primarily domestic. She is an entrepreneur of the first order. And this passage was written as an oracle, a teaching, a set of instructions for how a king should recognize a worthy person. It was written by a mother, the mother of King Lemuel, whose name we are given, though her own is not. She composed it. She taught it to her son. A woman wrote the most celebrated description of ideal personhood in the wisdom literature of the Bible, and she taught it to the king she raised. Let these names drift with you into the quiet now. Bathsheba on her throne at Solomon's right hand. Esther in the Persian court, timing every move, keeping her secret until the moment was exactly right. Vashti, who simply said no. Athaliah, who seized a kingdom. Jezebel, who wielded a royal seal. The Queen of Sheba, who crossed a continent with hard questions and 4,000 kilograms of gold. Abigail, who stopped an army with bread and a speech. Michal, who loved and protected and paid the cost of both. Women who understood power. Women who operated inside it and around it, and sometimes directly against it. Let them rest with you now. Your breathing is slow. The night is deep and still and safe. There is nothing more required of you tonight. Rest now. We will continue when you are ready. You are still here, still breathing, still held in the soft, unhurried dark. We have walked a long road together tonight. We began at the very roots of things, with the founding mothers who named God and remembered prophecies and wrote their names into the foundations of nations. Then we moved through an age of warriors and rescuers, women who stopped armies with bread and words, who ended tyrants with millstones, who had babies in temples and waited for the right moment. And then we entered the courts of kings, the gilded, dangerous world of queens and royal seals and political masterminds who understood power from the inside out. Now we go somewhere deeper still. We step away from the palace corridors and the battlefield, and we move toward something quieter, and in its quietness, more subversive. Because in every ancient society, in every culture that surrounded the world of the Bible, spiritual authority was the ultimate form of power. To speak for God, to stand between the human world and the divine, to interpret signs and dreams and the movements of history, that was not a small thing, and it was given repeatedly, unmistakably, to women. Let that truth breathe in the quiet with you as we begin. We have already met Miriam. We heard her voice at the edge of the Red Sea, tambourine in hand, leading a newly freed people in their first song of liberation. But there is a specific word the text gives her, a title that we should hold more carefully now. The Bible calls her a prophetess, not informally, not as a passing description. It is her official designation, given in the same verse that describes her leading the Song of the Sea. She is the first woman in all of Scripture to receive that title. And in the ancient world, the title of prophet carried a weight that we can barely translate into modern language. A prophet was not simply someone who predicted the future. A prophet was a spokesperson for the divine, an intermediary between heaven and earth, a person through whom the voice of God moved and spoke and acted in the world. Miriam held that office, formally, by title, and the evidence of her spiritual authority goes even further. There is a passage in the book of Micah, centuries after Miriam's time, where God speaks to Israel and reminds them of the leaders sent to bring them out of Egypt. The text names three: Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, not Moses and Aaron and their sister. Three leaders, equally named, equally cited, in a divine recounting of the Exodus. She was not the supporting cast. She was one of the three pillars of the whole story. Jump forward centuries. The kingdom of Judah in the reign of King Josiah, a moment of crisis and discovery. Wake as repairing the temple had found something extraordinary in the rubble. A scroll, ancient. The priests believed it was the book of the law, a foundational text that had, apparently, been lost or forgotten for so long that its rediscovery was seismic. But before anything could be done with it, before any reform could begin, before any decree could be issued, the scroll had to be verified, authenticated. Its authority had to be established by someone capable of discerning the genuine voice of God. And so the king summoned his inner circle, the high priest Hilkiah, the secretary, the court official, the king's attendant. These were the most powerful religious and political figures in the entire kingdom. And this delegation of the most senior men in Judah went to consult a woman named Huldah. She was a prophetess. She lived in Jerusalem, in a district called the Second Quarter. She was the wife of a man named Shallum, a keeper of the royal wardrobe. And she was, in that moment, the recognized spiritual authority to whom the high priest and the royal cabinet turned when they needed the word of God. She did not go to them. They came to her. She read the scroll. She gave her verdict. The text she had been shown was genuine. The word of God was in it. And then she delivered a prophecy of her own, a detailed declaration of what would come to pass, both the judgment for Israel's long unfaithfulness and the grace extended to Josiah personally because his heart had been tender before God. Josiah took her words and acted on them immediately. What followed was one of the most sweeping religious reforms in the history of Judah. Temples to foreign gods torn down, the Passover restored, the covenant renewed before the entire nation. It was the most significant spiritual and cultural transformation the kingdom had seen in generations. It was authorized by the testimony of a woman. Huldah authenticated the scripture. The reform flowed from her word. And she did it while the prophet Jeremiah was also active in Jerusalem, while Zephaniah was also prophesying. The king could have gone to either of them. He went to Huldah. She was not the only prophetess whose name we catch only briefly, like a reflection in still water. Isaiah, one of the towering figures of prophetic literature, a man whose words have been read and sung and prayed for nearly 3,000 years, had a wife. And when the text introduces her in connection with the birth of one of their children, it does not call her Isaiah's wife. It calls her the prophetess, not his wife who happened to be a prophet. The prophetess who happened to be his wife. The title comes first. It is her primary designation in the text. She is given no prophecies that have been preserved under her name. But the title she carries tells us something important, that prophetic authority in the world of the Hebrew Bible was not considered so extraordinary for a woman that it required lengthy explanation or special pleading. It was simply noted, matter-of-factly, the prophetess, and then there is no idea, a name that most readers of the Bible pass over without slowing down, because she appears in only one verse, in the book of Nehemiah, in what reads on the surface as an almost casual mention. Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem after the exile. He is facing opposition from multiple directions, political, military, social. And among the forces arrayed against him, he specifically names Noadiah the prophetess and asks God to remember what she and others did to intimidate him. Pause there for a moment. Nehemiah, a man with the authority of the Persian king behind him, a man directing the reconstruction of an entire city, felt threatened enough by a prophetess to specifically name her in his prayer as one of his significant adversaries. She had influence. She had enough spiritual authority and political weight that a governor with an imperial mandate considered her a serious obstacle. She opposed him. She used the platform of prophecy to resist the direction he was taking. And whatever she did, it was significant enough that it was still on Nehemiah's mind when he sat down to write. We have one verse about her, and in that one verse, she is formidable. Now we move to the temple in Jerusalem, a different era, the beginning of the 1st century, a very old woman who had made the temple her home. Her name was Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She had been married for 7 years before her husband died, and then she had lived as a widow. The text says she was 84 years old when the story reaches her, serving in the temple with fasting and prayer, day and night. She had been there a very long time, watching, waiting, praying in the particular way of someone who has been expecting something for decades and has not lost the expectation. And then, one morning, A young couple came into the temple carrying a newborn son for the ritual presentation that the law required. An old man named Simeon had already taken the child in his arms and spoken over him. And Anna came forward. The text says she began to speak, not to whisper, not to quietly murmur her thanks. She spoke about the child to everyone around her, to everyone in the temple who was waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. She proclaimed, publicly, freely, to anyone who would listen. She was, in that moment, one of the very first people in all of Luke's gospel to preach, to make a public declaration of who this infant was and what his arrival meant. She was 84 years old. She had been living in the temple in prayer and fasting for the better part of her life, and when the moment came, she raised her voice. The first preacher of the Messiah's arrival in the Gospel of Luke was an 84-year-old widow who had been waiting in the temple long enough that she recognized him when he came. In the early church, in the generation just after the resurrection, when the movement was spreading through the Mediterranean world and the structures of leadership were still forming, there was a man named Philip the evangelist. He had 4 daughters, all unmarried, and all 4 of them were recognized prophets. Not one gifted daughter, not one exception. 4 daughters, all 4 of them, holding spiritual authority in the community. Their names are not preserved, but their existence is. They are mentioned in the book of Acts as a simple, unremarkable fact, the kind of detail that is noted without fanfare because it was not considered remarkable in that specific community at that specific time. Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. The church knew them. The church recognized them. They are a small window into something much larger, into the reality of the early church before centuries of institutional narrowing, in which women's voices were part of the spiritual fabric of the community as a matter of course. Now we return to Hannah, whom we have not yet given her full due. She was a woman in tremendous private suffering, unable to conceive, provoked year after year by her husband's other wife who had children and made certain Hannah knew it. She went to the temple and wept. She prayed, and the nature of her prayer was unusual because she made a vow directly to God, without a priest as intermediary, without asking her husband's permission, without any of the structures that normally govern such transactions. She promised that if God gave her a son, she would give the child back. He would be dedicated to temple service for the whole of his life. She sealed the vow herself on her own authority. The priest Eli initially misread her entirely, seeing her lips moving without sound. He assumed she was drunk. She corrected him firmly. I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have been pouring out my soul before God. And she went home, and her face was no longer sad. She conceived. She gave birth to Samuel, who would become one of the greatest prophets and judges Israel ever produced. And when the time came, she kept her vow and brought him to the temple herself. But before all of that, before the dedication, before Samuel's ministry, before any of the history that would flow from that child's life, Hannah prayed again. And the prayer she prayed in that moment of fulfillment and surrender is one of the most theologically sophisticated pieces of poetry in the entire Hebrew Bible. She sang about the God who lifts the poor from the dust and seats them with princes, about the God who fills the hungry and leaves the full empty, about reversals of fortune so complete they overturn every human assumption about how power and weakness work, about a God who is not the patron of the comfortable, but the champion of the overlooked. The scholars are clear. When Mary, the mother of Jesus, sang her song of praise in the Gospel of Luke, the Magnificat, that soaring declaration of God's justice and reversal, she was singing in the tradition of Hannah. The literary echoes are unmistakable. Voice after voice mirrors the pattern, the theology, the imagery that Hannah established first. Hannah's prayer became the template for the most celebrated song in the New Testament. The Shunammite woman does not give us her name, but she gives us a portrait of spiritual and practical intelligence that is remarkable. She was wealthy, independent. The text makes clear that she was a woman of means who made her own decisions. When Elisha passed through her town regularly, she recognized something in him, a holiness, a quality of presence, and she told her husband, plainly, that she wanted to build a room for him on the roof of their house, a small room with a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp. She furnished it, she offered it. When her son, born in the fullness of hope after Elisha had prophesied her pregnancy, died suddenly in her arms one day, she laid him on Elisha's bed, closed the door, and went to find the prophet. Her husband did not know the child was dead. He asked where she was going. "It is well," she said. She saddled a donkey and rode hard to find Elisha, and when she reached him, she fell at his feet and held on with a grief that would not let go. Elisha's servant tried to push her away. Elisha told him to let her alone. He could see she was in bitter distress, and, the text notes with striking honesty, God had not told him why. The Shunammite woman had bypassed every intermediary. She had ridden directly to the source of spiritual power she trusted, and she held on until the miracle came. The child was restored to life, and Elisha presented him back to her. She had recognized holiness before anyone asked her to. She had served it practically, with her own money, on her own initiative. And when the crisis came, she went directly, without apology, to the one she believed could meet it. And then there are two figures on the edges of the prophetic world who push at the boundaries of what the text is willing to show us. The first is the woman of Tekoa, a wise woman, an actress, a rhetorician, hired by General Job to perform a piece of political theater for King David. Job wanted the king to recall his exiled son Absalom, but did not dare ask directly. So he engaged this woman to go before the king with a fabricated story, a widow with 2 sons, one of whom had killed the other, and now her family wanted the surviving son executed, and she would be left without heir or legacy. David gave his judgment in her favor, and then she turned the story back on him like a mirror, pointing out, with the precision of a legal scholar and the delivery of a stage actor, that his own judgment condemned his own refusal to bring his exiled son home. She had walked into the throne room and used narrative to do what no direct petition could accomplish. She had been hired for her craft, but the craft was entirely hers. She executed it flawlessly, and when the conversation turned and the king asked if Job had put her up to it, she told him plainly, yes. She did not flinch. The second figure sits at the outermost edge of the text's comfort, the medium of En door. King Saul, desperate on the eve of battle, had outlawed divination and necromancy throughout the land. And then, in his desperation, he disguised himself and went in secret to find a medium, specifically a woman. He found her and asked her to conjure the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. She was afraid. She knew what had happened to practitioners of her craft under Saul's decree. But she did the work. And the text, written by authors who had no reason to validate anything she did, records simply that it worked. Samuel appeared. He spoke. He delivered a genuine prophecy of doom that came to pass. Whether the ancient reader was meant to be troubled by that or awed by it, the text does not say. It simply records that a woman, practicing a condemned art, successfully reached across the boundary between the living and the dead, and that the king of Israel, who had outlawed everything she was, came to her in the night because there was no one else. And we close this segment where all of it, in some sense, was always pointing. The prophet Joel, writing in the ancient world, spoke a word that the early church would seize upon as the charter for everything they believed had changed. The Apostle Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit had fallen on the gathered community in wind and fire, and he quoted Joel directly as his explanation for what was happening. The prophecies said this: "I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy." Sons and daughters, not sons, with daughters as a footnote, not men, with women as an exception. The foundational prophecy of the outpouring of the Spirit named them together in the same breath as equal recipients of the same gift. Peter chose that prophecy. He could have chosen others. He chose the one that named women explicitly as prophets in the age of the Spirit. And he preached it on the first day of the church's public life as a defining description of what God was doing in the world. The spiritual authority of women was not a late development, not a footnote, not an accommodation. It was built into the DNA of the movement from its very first morning. Let these voices settle into the stillness with you now. Miriam, the first to hold the title. Huldah, who authenticated the scripture that changed a nation. The prophetess wife of Isaiah, named by her vocation first. Noadiah, formidable enough to trouble a governor. Anna, who preached in the temple at Etaphor. Philip's 4 daughters, all of them prophets. Hannah, whose prayer became the model for Mary's song. The Shunammite woman, who recognized holiness and rode hard for a miracle. The wise woman of Tekoa, who turned narrative into policy. The medium of Endor, who worked at the very edge of the permissible and was sought by a king. And the promise of Joel, carried on Peter's lips into the morning of a new age. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Let those words rest in you like light. Your breath is slow. Your body is heavy and still. The night holds you gently. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to carry. Rest now. We will continue when you are ready. You are still here, still breathing, still resting in that deep, sacred quiet. We have traveled a remarkable distance together tonight. From the very beginning, from Sarah and Hagar at the root of everything, through the warriors and rescuers who stopped armies and saved bloodlines, through the queens and political masterminds who held thrones and wrote imperial decrees, through the prophets and spiritual authorities who authenticated scripture and preached in temples and named God in the wilderness. Now we arrive at the final movement of our journey tonight, and in some ways, it is the most revolutionary of all, because everything we have traced across centuries, the courage, the intelligence, the spiritual authority, the political acumen, the willingness to act at enormous personal cost, all of it flows forward into a moment of radical new beginning, a movement born in an occupied territory under the shadow of empire, spreading through house churches and back roads and prison cells and merchant routes, carried in significant part by women whose names the tradition has sometimes tried to minimize, but whose presence the earliest texts preserve with unmistakable clarity. These are the women of the early church, the patrons who funded it, the deacons and apostles who led it, the teachers who corrected its theology, the hosts who opened their homes and became, in doing so, the physical foundation of a global movement. Let their stories come to you now, softly, one after another, like lamps being lit along a road. We begin with Mary Magdalene, and we begin there with a deliberate intention to set aside centuries of misidentification and misrepresentation, because almost everything the popular imagination associates with her name has no foundation in the text. The text tells us this. She was a woman from the town of Magdala, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. She had been cured of 7 demons, a condition the ancient world used to describe what we might today understand as severe mental or physical illness, something that had clearly been both chronic and debilitating. And after that healing, she became one of the most consistently present figures in the entire gospel narrative. She traveled with Jesus. She was there at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled. She was at the tomb. She was, by every gospel account, among the first to arrive at the tomb on the morning of the resurrection. And then, in the Gospel of John, she is the first to encounter the risen Christ. She mistakes him for the gardener at first, in her grief, and then he speaks her name, Mary, and she turns. What happens next is the foundation of something enormous. Jesus gives her a commission. Go to my brothers, he tells her, and tell them what you have seen. Tell them I am ascending to the Father. Mary Magdalene was the first person in human history to be given the task of preaching the resurrection. The first evangelist of the central claim of the Christian faith was a woman. She went to the disciples, the men who had locked themselves in a room out of fear, and she told them what she had seen. The early church would later give her a title that honored what the text had made plain, Apostle to the Apostles. And the text tells us something else about her that is easy to miss because it is mentioned without fanfare, folded into a passage in Luke alongside other names. Mary Magdalene, along with several other women, supported Jesus and his disciples out of her own private means. She was a financial patron of the movement. She used her own resources to sustain it. The ministry of Jesus was, in part, funded by a woman he had healed, and she was present from its earliest days in Galilee all the way to the tomb on the 3rd morning. She was not alone in that financial patronage. Beside her name in Luke's account are 2 others, Joanna and Susanna. Joanna carries with her a detail that is quietly staggering. She was the wife of Chusa, the manager of King Hirad's household. This was not a modest social position. Chusa occupied a senior administrative role in the court of the ruler of Galilee, a position of wealth, influence, and proximity to power. Joanna lived inside the establishment, connected to the very apparatus of the ruling class. And she left it, or at least redirected the resources it gave her, to fund a wandering rabbi from Nazareth whose message was, among other things, about the dangers of wealth and the emptiness of worldly power. The movement that challenged the powerful was being financially sustained by someone who lived in the court of the powerful. The irony is not accidental. It speaks to something the Gospels return to repeatedly, the capacity of those who have seen the machinery of empire from the inside to recognize its ultimate bankruptcy with a clarity that others might not possess. Joanna used what she had access to in service of something she believed in more than her social position. She showed up at the tomb that morning too, among the women who brought spices, among the first witnesses of everything the resurrection would mean. And Susanna, named once in that same verse, alongside Mary Magdalene and Joanna, she gave from her private means. She is there in the record. Her name was worth preserving. She was part of the foundation. Now we move from the Galilean countryside to the edge of Europe, to a riverbank in Philippi, in Macedonia, to the first recorded moment of the gospel crossing from Asia into the Western world. Paul and his companions had arrived in Philippi and, on the Sabbath, went outside the city gate to the river, where they expected to find a place of prayer. There was no synagogue large enough to require one. Jewish custom required 10 men for that. Instead, they found women gathered by the water, and among them was Lydia. She was from Thyatira, a city in the region of Asia Minor known for its trade guilds, and she was a dealer in purple cloth. This is not a small designation. Purple dye in the ancient world, produced from murex shellfish, an extraordinarily labor-intensive process, was among the most expensive commodities in existence. It was the color of royalty, of imperial power, of the highest levels of wealth and prestige. Only the very wealthy could afford to wear it. Only the very successful could afford to trade in it. Lydia was a businesswoman operating at the luxury end of an international market. She was, by every indication, wealthy, independent, and commercially sophisticated. She listened to Paul. The text says that God opened her heart to receive what he was saying. She was baptized, and her entire household with her. And then she did something that set the course of everything that followed. She insisted Paul and his companions come and stay at her house. It was not a casual invitation. The language she used, "If you consider me a believer," carried the weight of a formal offer. Her house became the base of operations for Paul's work in Europe. The first European house church met in her home. She was its host, its patron, its anchor. When Paul and Silas were later arrested, beaten, and miraculously released from prison, the first place they went was back to Lydia's house, where they met with the believers and encouraged them before leaving the city. Every strand of Christian faith that entered Europe in those early decades passed through the door of a wealthy purple cloth merchant from Thyatira who insisted the apostles come and stay. And then there is Phoebe, She is introduced in Paul's letter to the Romans in a way that, when read carefully, reveals her to be one of the most important figures in the entire early church, not despite the brevity of her introduction, but because of the specific words Paul chooses even in that brevity. He calls her a diakonos of the church in century. The word he uses is the same word used elsewhere in the New Testament for the formal leadership role of deacon, position of recognized authority and service within the community. She is the only person in the New Testament explicitly identified by that title in connection with a specific local church. She held office. She had a role. It was formal enough to name. Paul also calls her a prostitute, a word that carries the meaning of patron, protector, benefactor, a person of means and standing who used those resources to support and advocate for others. She had been a patron to many people, Paul says, including to him personally. And then he did something that tells us more than any title could. He entrusted her with the letter to the Romans. This was not a simple errand. The letter to the Romans is the most theologically dense, most carefully constructed, most consequential document Paul ever wrote, a systematic exposition of his entire theological framework, addressed to a church he had never visited, in the capital city of the empire. It was the kind of letter that required not just delivery but explanation. Ancient letters were typically read aloud by the person who carried them, who could also answer questions and clarify the author's meaning. Paul put that letter in Phoebe's hands. She carried it from century to Rome. She protected it on the journey. She walked into a church full of people she may never have met, and she read it aloud, from beginning to end, explaining its most complex passages, representing Paul's thought in the city where it mattered most. The first person to publicly expound the book of Romans, the letter that would later shape Augustine's theology, Luther's Reformation, Wesley's revival, was a woman. Her name was Phoebe. In Ephesus, the sophisticated, cosmopolitan capital of the Roman province of Asia, there was a preacher named Apollos. The text describes him with admiring precision. He was learned, eloquent, fervent in spirit, accurate in his knowledge of Scripture. He was, by any measure, a gifted and highly trained theological communicator, and his theology was incomplete. He knew the baptism of John, but had not yet understood the fullness of what had come after. And when Priscilla and her husband Aquila heard him speak, they recognized the gap. They took him aside, privately, carefully, without public embarrassment, and explained to him the way of God more accurately. The name that appears first in that account is Priscilla's, and this is not an isolated occurrence. In 4 of the 6 places in the New Testament where Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned together, her name comes first. In the ancient world, where convention almost universally placed the husband's name before the wife's, this consistent reversal carries meaning. Scholars have long argued that it suggests she held either the highest social standing or the greater theological prominence in their partnership, or perhaps both. Priscilla corrected the theology of one of the most gifted preachers in the early church. She did it with her husband, yes, but her name leads the account. She was a teacher. She was recognized as one, and the man she taught went on to become a powerful advocate for the faith, built in part on the foundation she helped him complete. In Corinth, a woman named Chloe ran a household prominent enough that her people, her staff, her associates, her network, had direct communication with the Apostle Paul. When divisions began tearing the church at Corinth apart, it was Chloe's household that reported the situation to Paul. This was consequential, because Paul's response to that report was the letter we call 1 Corinthians, one of the longest, most theologically rich, most practically detailed letters in the entire New Testament. It addressed the divisions, the theological disputes, the questions about resurrection and spiritual gifts and the nature of love itself. 1 Corinthians exists because a businesswoman in Corinth had people she trusted, and they carried the news to Paul, and he wrote back. And there is Junior, in his letter to the Romans, in the same passage where he commends Phoebe, Paul sends greetings to Andronicus and Junior, whom he describes as his relatives, his fellow prisoners, and, in the phrase that has been debated and suppressed and recovered across centuries of interpretation, outstanding among the apostles. Junior is a woman's name, Roman, feminine, clay, and for much of the church's history, that created a problem significant enough that some translators quietly changed her name to a masculine form, Junes, without any manuscript evidence for doing so, simply because the theology of the people doing the translating could not accommodate what the text plainly said. But the text says what it says. Paul knew her. He had been in prison with her. She had been jailed for her work in spreading the gospel, as he had been. She predated him in the faith. He notes, she was outstanding among the apostles. She is the only explicitly named female apostle in the New Testament, and she earned the title the same way the others did, through proclamation, through suffering, through the relentless work of taking the message into the world regardless of the cost. Nympha opened her home in Laodicea, and a church gathered there. Paul's letter to the Colossians specifically names her and sends greetings to the church in her house. She is not described as a passive host who simply made the space available. In the world of the early church, the person in whose home the community gathered was typically also its primary patron, its protector, and often its functional leader. The host was the church's anchor. Nympha's name was worth including. Her house was worth naming. The church that met in it was worth greeting. She was, in every practical sense, the leader of the community she housed. And finally, in the coastal city of Joppa, there was a woman named Tabitha, called by some in the Greek-speaking community Dorcas, which carries the same meaning, gazelle. She was a disciple. The text uses the female form of the word deliberately. She was a Mathitria, a female disciple, one of the very few times that specific feminine form appears in the New Testament. And she made things. She was a maker of clothing, specifically of robes and garments, and she gave what she made to widows, to the women in her community who had the least protection, the least resources, the least standing in the social world of their time. The operation she ran was not small. When she died suddenly and Peter was summoned from nearby Lydda, he arrived to find the room full of widows weeping and holding up the garments she had made them. The charity she had built was so woven into the lives of the most vulnerable people in Joppa that her absence was immediately, materially catastrophic for them. Peter cleared the room. He knelt. He prayed. He spoke her name. Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes. She sat up. He presented her alive to the community. The tradition has sometimes told this story primarily as a demonstration of apostolic power. But look at what the text makes clear. The reason for the miracle, the reason the community sent urgently for Peter in the first place, the reason the widows were weeping and showing him the garments, was Tabitha herself. Her work, her love, her charity, the irreplaceable, specific, generous life she had built. She was brought back not because she was passive or symbolic, but because she was essential, because what she was doing was too important to stop. Let these names rest with you now in the quiet. Mary Magdalene, apostle to the apostles, the first to preach the resurrection. Joanna, who left Herod's court to fund something greater. Susanna, faithful patron, name worth preserving. Lydia, who opened her house and thereby opened Europe. Phoebe, who carried the letter that shaped 1,000 years of theology. Priscilla, whose name came first. Chloe, whose household prompted one of the greatest letters ever written. Junia, outstanding among the apostles, who went to prison for what she believed. Nympho, who anchored a church in her home. Tabitha, who made things with her hands and gave them to widows, and was brought back because she was too needed to lose. They were not on the margins of the early church. They were in its walls, in its foundations, in its first words and its first letters and its first journeys into the unknown. Let that truth hold you gently as the night deepens. Your breath is slow. Your body is still. You are resting in something ancient and good. There is nothing more for you to do tonight. Rest now, and know that you have heard true things. You are still here, still breathing, still held in the deep, unhurried quiet of this night. We have come a long way together, through the desert wells and the palace corridors, through the battlefields and the temple courts, through the prison cells and the house churches and the merchant routes of the ancient Mediterranean world. We have heard the names of women who named God, who authenticated Scripture, who funded revolutions, who carried letters that shaped centuries, who preached the resurrection before anyone else dared to say the words out loud. Now we arrive at something intimate, something that carries, beneath all its history and theology, the particular warmth of the domestic and the maternal, not in the diminished sense that word has sometimes been used, as though the home were a smaller stage, a lesser theater of consequence, but in the truest sense, the sense that understands a kitchen table can be a seat of power, that a mother's voice in a child's ear can shape the course of a generation, that the decision made in a private house on an ordinary evening can become the pivot point of history. These are the mothers of the New Testament, and they are, in their own way, as formidable as any warrior or queen we have met tonight. Let their stories come to you now, gently, like candlelight in a warm room. We begin with Mary, and we begin not at the beginning of her story, not with the angel's announcement, not with Bethlehem or the manger, but at a wedding, because it is there, at a wedding feast in a village called Cana in Galilee, that we see her in a light that is sometimes overlooked entirely. The wine had run out. In the culture of that world, this was not a minor social embarrassment. A family hosted a wedding feast for days, and the provision of food and wine was not simply hospitality, it was honor. To run out of wine was to fail publicly, to expose the family to shame that would be remembered and spoken of for years. It was a crisis of a particular, human, socially devastating kind. Mary noticed, and she went to her son. What she said was simple: "They have no wine." 3 words, not a question, not exactly a request. An observation delivered with the quiet expectation of someone who knows the person she is speaking to and knows what they are capable of. Jesus' response, "My hour has not yet come," is one of the most discussed phrases in the Gospel of John. It has been interpreted as a gentle resistance, a hesitation, a statement about divine timing. And yet what happened next makes the exchange remarkable. Mary did not argue with him. She did not push or plead. She simply turned to the servants and said, with complete assurance, "Do whatever he tells you." She had already decided what he was going to do. Before he had said yes, before the water jars were filled, before the miracle happened. The Gospel of John records this as the first of Jesus' signs, the beginning of his public ministry, the act that inaugurated everything that followed. And it happened because his mother noticed a problem at a wedding, told him about it, and then turned to the servants with the calm certainty that it would be handled. Mary initiated the first miracle. She did not wait to be told. She saw what was needed and she moved. There is another dimension of Mary that the tradition has sometimes softened into pure tenderness, into blue robes and gentle acceptance, that the text itself does not soften at all. Her song, the Magnificat, the prayer she sang when she visited her cousin Elizabeth and felt the child leap within her, is one of the most politically charged passages in the entire New Testament. It is not a lullaby. It is not a quiet expression of personal gratitude. It is a declaration of cosmic reversal delivered with the confidence of someone who has looked at the structure of the world and understood that it is about to be unmade. She sang about rulers being pulled from their thrones, about the proud being scattered, about the rich being sent away empty and the hungry being filled with good things. She sang about power being turned upside down, not metaphorically, not spiritually in some vague interior sense, but structurally, materially, concretely. A young woman in an occupied territory, carrying an unplanned pregnancy that could have cost her everything in the social world she inhabited, stood up and sang about the overthrow of the powerful. It was a radical song, radical enough that during certain periods of political repression in the 20th century, governments in Central America banned its public recitation because they considered it dangerous. They were not wrong about what it said. They were simply on the wrong side of it, and Mary sang it, freely, joyfully, in the house of her cousin, before anyone outside her immediate family knew what was coming. She carried that courage all the way to the end. When the crucifixion came, when Jesus was executed by the Roman state as a political criminal, when association with him was genuinely dangerous, when the charge of sedition hung over everyone connected to him, Mary was at the foot of the cross. The gospel accounts are honest about what happened to others. The male disciples, with the exception of the beloved disciple, had fled. The danger was real. The risk of being identified as a follower of a man just condemned by Rome was not abstract. It was the risk of arrest, of torture, of the same fate. Mary stood there. She watched her son die. She did not flee. She did not hide. She stood in plain sight, in public, at the foot of an instrument of Roman execution, and she remained. There is a particular kind of courage in that which has no strategy attached to it, no political calculation, no long-term plan. It is simply the courage of a mother who will not leave, who will not look away, who will be present at the worst moment because presence is the only thing she has left to give. And after everything, after the resurrection, after the ascension, after the disciples gathered in Jerusalem to wait for what had been promised, Mary was that too. The book of Acts places her by name among the 120 believers gathered in the upper room, praying together in the days before Pentecost. She was part of the founding community of the church, not as a relic, not as a symbol, but as a participant, praying, present, still there. From the first miracle to the founding of the church, she was there. Now we turn to Elizabeth and find in her someone whose brief appearance in the narrative carries remarkable weight. She was the wife of a priest named Zechariah, advanced in years, and childless for a lifetime that had carried its own grief. When the angel announced to Zechariah that she would bear a son, he doubted and was struck silent. Elizabeth herself received no angel, no announcement, no vision. She simply conceived and withdrew for 5 months and sat with the private knowledge of what was happening. When Mary came to visit, carrying her own extraordinary, terrifying, brand new secret, it was Elizabeth who recognized it first. The child leapt in her womb, and she was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she cried out in a loud voice, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. Why am I so honored that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" She called Mary the mother of her Lord before a single miracle had been performed, before a single sermon had been preached, before anyone outside a handful of people in 2 small villages in Judea knew anything at all. Elizabeth prophesied, and the text is deliberate about the spirit that filled her in that moment, not as a quiet suggestion but as a declaration, spoken in a loud voice to a young woman who had just arrived at her door. She was the first human being, according to Luke's Gospel, to recognize who Mary's child was. A woman in her 3rd trimester in a hill country village, speaking a theological truth that would take the rest of the world years to begin to understand. And she brought her own fire, too. When her son was born and the family and neighbors gathered and assumed the boy would be named after his father, Elizabeth said no. His name is John. They turned to the silent Zechariah to confirm or override. But Elizabeth had already spoken, with the assurance of someone who knows what she received and is not interested in renegotiating it with family tradition. She was right. Zechariah confirmed it. The child was named John, and that child would become the voice in the wilderness, the one who prepared the way, a destiny Elizabeth had received and held and protected against the casual pressure of patriarchal custom. Timothy was one of the most important figures in Paul's ministry, his closest associate, his representative to the churches, his son in the faith, the person he trusted with the most delicate and consequential missions. Paul wrote him 2 letters that became part of the canon of Scripture. He is a significant figure in the story of the early church. And when Paul wanted to name the source of Timothy's deep theological formation, the roots of his sincere faith, he did not point to a teacher or a rabbi or a moment of personal revelation. He named 2 women, Lois, Timothy's grandmother, Eunice, his mother. Paul wrote that the faith that lived in Timothy had first lived in them, that the sincere, unfeigned, deeply rooted belief that made Timothy who he was had been planted and cultivated by the women who raised him. They had taught him the Scriptures from childhood. Paul noted elsewhere, they had formed him theologically before he was old enough to seek out teachers on his own. The person Paul called his son, the person he trusted above others to represent him and carry his work forward, had been made by his mother and grandmother. Their names are parenthesis in the letters, almost. But in that parenthesis lives the entire story of how faith moves through time, not only through grand proclamation and apostolic authority, but through a grandmother's voice reading Scripture to a child, through a mother's patient, daily, faithful formation of a young person's interior life. Lois and Eunice shaped the early church through the one they raised. Salome, the mother of James and John, appears in the Gospels in a moment that has sometimes been read as comic, the ambitious mother lobbying for her son's advancement. And there is something humanly recognizable in it. Yes, she came to Jesus and asked that her 2 sons be granted the seats of highest honor in his coming kingdom, one on his right, one on his left. But look at the full picture. This was a woman who understood something about who Jesus was and where things were going. She brought her request as one who believed, genuinely, concretely believed, that a kingdom was coming. She was not asking for social advancement in the ordinary world. She was asking within the framework of a faith that had led her to follow, to give her sons to this movement, to travel with the group and support its work. She was bold. She was direct. She asked for what she wanted without apology. Jesus told her she didn't know what she was asking for, that the seats she requested were not his to grant, and she accepted that. But she remained. She was there at the crucifixion. She was among the women who came to the tomb. She stayed the whole length of the story, through the hour when the kingdom she had believed in looked most like a failure. Her faith outlasted the embarrassment of the request, and she was still there, still present, at the moment when everything changed. And then there is the other Mary, not the mother of Jesus, not Mary Magdalene, the Mary who owned a house in Jerusalem, a large house, the text implies, with a gate and a servant girl named Rhoda and room enough for a significant gathering of people. Her son was John Mark, who would go on to travel with Paul and Barnabas and is traditionally associated with the Gospel of Mark. But she is not remembered simply as his mother. She is remembered as the person whose house was the underground headquarters of the early church in Jerusalem. When persecution came, when Herod arrested the apostles and James was executed and Peter was imprisoned under maximum security conditions, chained between 2 soldiers, with guards at the door, the church gathered at her house and prayed through the night for Peter's release. And when the miracle happened, when the angel came and the chains fell off and the doors opened of their own accord, and Peter found himself standing free in the street, he knew where to go. He went directly to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Not to the most prominent male leader, not to an official gathering place. He went to her house, because that was where the church was. That was the center. That was the place that had been kept open, kept safe, kept available through the most dangerous period the community had yet faced. When Peter knocked at the gate and Rhoda, the servant girl, recognized his voice and ran back inside in her excitement without actually opening the gate, leaving him still standing outside while she told the praying community that the answer was at the door. The entire scene is alive with the texture of a community that had made someone's home into something sacred. That home belonged to Mary. She had opened it. She had kept it open. She had let it become the place the church ran to when everything else was under threat. In every age, the community of faith has needed houses like that. Steady houses, open houses, houses where the light stays on. Hayes was one of the first. Let these names rest with you now in the warmth of this closing movement. Mary of Nazareth, who initiated the Feist miracle, who sang about the overthrow of the powerful, who stood at the cross when others fled, who was still there in the upper room at the beginning of everything new. Elizabeth, who recognized the truth before anyone told her to and said it in a loud voice. Lois and Eunice, who raised a man the church could not have done without. Salome, who asked boldly and stayed faithfully. Mary, the mother of John Mark, who kept her house open in the dark, who made of her home a sanctuary the church could run to. They were not waiting on the edges of the story. They were in it, deeply in its first miracle and its founding prayer, in its formation of leaders and its underground shelters and its loud voice of prophecy in a hill country living room. The story of faith has always moved through people like these, through the ones who notice what is needed and say so, through the ones who stay when staying is costly, through the ones who open their doors and keep them open, no matter what is happening outside. Let that truth be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. You have heard so many names, so many stories, so much courage and intelligence and faith and fire, woven through centuries, carried forward from woman to woman to woman across the whole long length of the human story. Let them rest in you now like seeds in good ground. Your breath is slow and even. The night is deep and still. You are safe and held and at rest. There is nothing more required of you. Sleep now and know that the story continues. It always continues, and it has, from the very beginning, been carried by hands like yours. You are still here, still breathing, still resting in that soft, ancient quiet. We have traveled together through 7 movements of a story that is older than any book that contains it. We began at the very root of things, with women who named God in the desert and remembered prophesies that their husbands had forgotten. We moved through battlefields and throne rooms, through temple courts and prison cells, through house churches and merchant routes and the quiet rooms where children are raised into people who change the world. And now we arrive at the last movement, the one that in some ways brings all the others into focus, because everything we have traced, the courage of the warriors, the precision of the queens, the authority of the prophets, the faithfulness of the patrons, all of it rests on something even more fundamental, something that had to be fought for in small moments and large ones, against the accumulated weight of a world that had decided, long before any of these women were born, where they were permitted to stand, what they were permitted to say, who they were permitted to be. These final women are the ones who looked at those boundaries and stepped across them anyway, not always with armies, not always with royal seals or apostolic commissions, sometimes simply with a question, a touch, a retort sharp enough to change the course of a conversation, a willingness to sit in a place they weren't supposed to sit, or to walk into a crowd they weren't supposed to enter, or to send a message to a Roman prefect in the middle of a trial because a dream told them something important was happening and someone needed to know. These are the rule breakers, the debaters, the defiers of norms, and they are, in their own way, the most quietly radical women in this entire story. Let their words and their gestures come to you now, gently, in the deep of the night. We begin in the region of Tyre and Sidon, Gentile territory, the borderlands. A woman came to Jesus. She was Syro-Phoenician, Greek by culture, Canaanite by heritage, not Jewish by any measure of the religious world that surrounded him. And she came with urgency. Her daughter was suffering, and she needed help. What happened next is one of the most startling exchanges in the entire gospel narrative, because Jesus, at least initially, declined. He said that his mission was to the lost sheep of Israel, that it was not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. It was a sharp saying. The word he used, dogs, was a term of ethnic and social contempt, the kind of language that marked the boundary between insider and outsider in the ancient world. Whatever its precise intent, whatever theological point was being made, the surface of the statement was a refusal, and the woman did not withdraw. She did not accept the boundary. She engaged. She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." It was a retort of extraordinary deftness. She took the very image he had used, accepted its terms entirely without disputing them, and turned it back to reveal what it implied. If the children are at the table and the dogs are beneath it, then they are in the same house. The crumbs fall from the table. The children and the dogs are not as far apart as the metaphor suggests. She had won the argument, not by rejecting the framework, but by reasoning within it more precisely than it had been offered. And Jesus said so, explicitly. He told her that for this answer, this specific, witty, theologically precise answer, she could go home. Her daughter was healed. He did not heal her despite her argument. He healed her daughter because of it. He named her intellect as the grounds of the miracle. Her persistence, her refusal to accept the first answer, her capacity to think on her feet in the middle of a charged and unequal encounter, that was what he honored. That was what he called faith. In the Gospels, there are very few moments where someone is described as winning a debate with Jesus. This woman did, and he commended her for it, openly, without qualification. In Bethany, a village just outside Jerusalem, there was a family Jesus loved. 2 sisters and a brother, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And in the story of that family, Two of the most quietly revolutionary moments in the Gospel record are preserved. When Lazarus died and Jesus arrived, 4 days after the burial, too late by every human calculation, it was Martha who came out to meet him on the road. Mary stayed in the house. And Martha, the practical one, the one who is sometimes characterized as spiritually second to her more contemplative sister, said to Jesus directly, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It was not a complaint delivered softly. It was a confrontation, an honest, grief-filled, theologically loaded challenge spoken to the face of the man she had trusted and who had not come in time. She was not softening it for his comfort. She was not performing the appropriate posture of a grieving woman in the presence of a rabbi. She said what was true, what she felt, what she needed him to hear. And then, in the conversation that followed, she made a declaration. Jesus told her that her brother would rise again. He told her that he was the resurrection and the life. And he asked her, "Do you believe this?" Her answer is one of the great confessions of faith in the New Testament. "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." The same confession that the Apostle Peter made at Caesarea Philippi, the same foundational declaration, the same theological bedrock on which the church would later say it was built. Martha said it too, fully and without prompting, in the middle of her grief, on a road outside a village, with her brother 4 days in the tomb. Peter's confession is preached from pulpits. It is cited in theological texts as the cornerstone of Christian faith. Martha's confession, identical in its content, made in circumstances far more brutal, is far less often given its proper weight. She said what Peter said, in grief, on a road, before the miracle. Her sister Mary moved differently. Where Martha confronted in words, Mary acted in gestures. And the gestures she chose were so far outside the norms of her world that they require us to understand those norms to fully grasp what she was doing. In the culture of first-century Judaism, to sit at the feet of a rabbi was a specific and formal posture. It was the posture of a disciple, a student receiving instruction from a teacher. The phrase carries technical weight. When Paul describes himself in Acts as having been educated at the feet of Gamaliel, he is using the same language, describing the same formal relationship of student to master. It was a position reserved, without question, for men. Mary sat there. When her sister Martha complained that Mary had left her to do all the serving alone and asked Jesus to tell her to help, Jesus said something that was, in the context of that world, quietly explosive. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. He named her right to be there. He protected it against the very reasonable objection that she was violating social order. He said she had chosen correctly. And later, in the days before the crucifixion, when Jesus came to Bethany again, Mary did something even more extraordinary. She took a jar of pure nard, an extraordinarily expensive perfume, with a year's wages, and she broke it open and anointed Jesus. She poured it over him entirely and wiped his feet with her hair. The room erupted in objection. The waste, the extravagance, the indecency of a woman loosening her hair in public. the impropriety of the whole gesture. Jesus silenced them. He said she had done a beautiful thing. He said she had anointed his body for burial, receiving, in other words, the act as a prophetic gesture, a priestly act of preparation. He told them that wherever the gospel was preached in the whole world, what she had done would be told in memory of her. A woman performed the last anointing of Jesus before his death. She took on the role of priest and prophet in a room full of objection, and he received it as the truest thing done to him in those final days. There was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years of a condition that, in the religious law of her world, rendered her ritually impure at all times. 12 years during which she could not enter the temple, could not participate in communal worship, could not touch another person without making them impure by contact. 12 years of being legally, socially, religiously untouchable. She had spent everything she had on physicians. Nothing had worked. She was not better. She was worse. And she heard that Jesus was passing through, and she made a decision. She walked into the crowd, dense, pressing, the kind of crowd that jostled and pushed. Every person she touched, by the law's own logic, became impure through contact with her. She moved through that crowd anyway, deliberately, with a specific destination in mind, the hem of his garment, and she reached out and touched it. The healing was immediate. She felt it in her body at once, and she tried to disappear back into the crowd. He stopped. He asked who had touched him. His disciples were baffled. The crowd was pressing in on all sides, hundreds of people in contact. But he felt something had happened, that power had gone out from him, and he looked around. She came forward, trembling, and told him everything. And he did not rebuke her for the violation of purity law. He did not tell her she should not have done it. He called her daughter, an intimate, tender word, and told her that her faith had healed her. "Go in peace," he said. "Be freed from your suffering." She had broken the law. She had done it deliberately and knowingly, after 12 years of forced exclusion from the community, and he named it faith. He named the transgression as the precise form her faith took. The reaching out in violation of what had been used to keep her contained. That was the act of trust he honored. At a well in Samaria, at midday, Jesus sat down to rest while his disciples went to buy food. A woman came to draw water. And what followed is the longest recorded conversation Jesus has with any individual in the Gospel of John. She was Samaritan, a member of a people the Jewish world of Jesus' time viewed with contempt, a mixed heritage population with their own version of the faith and their own holy mountain, long despised. And she was a woman, and it was midday, the detail that has led many readers to assume she was socially marginalized even within her own community, coming to the well at the hour when others would not be there. He asked her for water. She was immediately struck by the strangeness of the request. A Jewish man speaking to a Samaritan woman in public was a violation of multiple social codes simultaneously. She said so plainly. He told her that if she knew who was asking, she would have asked him for living water. And the conversation that unfolded from there was not simple or gentle. She pushed back. She questioned. She engaged with him on the history of the well, on the question of Jewish versus Samaritan worship, on the proper mountain for approaching God. She brought to the conversation a geopolitical and theological sophistication that the text does not diminish or explain away. She was thinking, arguing, asking real questions, pressing on real contradictions. He told her things he had told almost no one. He revealed himself to her. I am he, the one who is speaking to you, in language so direct that it startled even the disciples when they returned. And she left her water jar at the well and went back to her town. She said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" And they came, not because a famous preacher had arrived, not because a sign had been performed in the marketplace, because a woman at a well came back to her town with a question on her lips and a light in her eyes that made people follow her back to the source. The text says that many Samaritans from that town believed because of her testimony, and then more believed because they had heard him themselves. But the reason they came in the first place, the reason the door was opened at all, was her. The first mass evangelism recorded in the Gospel of John. The first time a whole community turned toward Jesus. It was started by a Samaritan woman who had gone to a well at noon and got into a theological argument with a stranger and could not stop herself from telling everyone what had happened. And finally, a Roman woman, a woman outside the covenant, outside the community of faith, outside every cycle of belonging that the story of this night has traced. Her name is not given to us. She is identified only as the wife of Pontius Pilate, and she appears in the gospel record at a single, pivotal, irreversible moment during the trial that would end in the crucifixion. Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat. The crowd was pressing for a verdict. The machinery of Roman justice, or what passed for it in that charged and violent morning, was moving toward its conclusion. And a message arrived. It came from his wife. She had sent word urgently in the middle of the proceedings to say, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered greatly in a dream today because of him." She had dreamed about Jesus. The dream had disturbed her enough that she could not stay silent, could not simply wait for the proceedings to conclude, could not treat the matter as her husband's business alone. She interrupted a Roman trial to deliver a prophetic warning. She was the only Roman in the gospel narratives to defend him, the only voice from inside the apparatus of empire to say, publicly and urgently, that what was happening was wrong. Pilate's own wife, speaking from the authority of a dream, from whatever had moved in her during the night, sent word that he was innocent. He did not listen. We know how it ended, but she had spoken. The record preserved it. An unnamed Roman woman's voice raised in defense of an innocent man, delivered at the exact moment when it was hardest and most costly and ultimately unsuccessful, and still, somehow, still worth saying. There is a kind of courage in speaking when you already suspect you will not be heard. She spoke anyway, and so we reach the end of our long journey tonight. We have traveled from the desert wells of the ancient Near East to the merchant routes of the Roman Empire, from the tents of the matriarchs to the throne rooms of queens, from the battlefields of Canaan to the house churches of Asia Minor, From the banks of the Red Sea, where Miriam lifted her tambourine, to the well in Samaria, where a woman left her water jar and ran to tell her town. And what we have found, woven through all of it like a single unbroken thread, is this: that the women in this story were never passive. They were never incidental. They were never simply waiting for the men to finish so that history could resume. They argued with God and they argued with Jesus. They outwitted pharaohs and they negotiated with generals. They authenticated scripture and they funded revolutions. They broke purity laws in crowds and they anointed bodies for burial in rooms full of objectors. They preached in temples at Etaphor, and they carried imperial letters across the Mediterranean world, and they raised children who changed the course of the church. They were told by their world where they were permitted to stand, and they stood somewhere else. They were told what they were permitted to say, and they said something more. They were told who they were permitted to be, and they became something larger. The Syrophoenician woman who won the debate, Martha who made the confession in grief, Mary who sat where she was not supposed to sit and poured out everything she had, the woman who bled for 12 years and reached through the crowd, the Samaritan woman who left her jar and brought a whole town back to the well, Pilate's wife who sent a message no one wanted to receive. They are all resting in the quiet with you now. All of them, every name we have spoken tonight, every story we have carried from beginning to end. They are here in the dark with you, like lights that have been burning for a very long time, long before you arrived, long enough to have lit the way for everything that came after. Let them rest in you now. You have been breathing slowly for a long time. Your body is heavy and still and at peace. The world outside is quiet. The night is full and deep and safe. You have heard true things tonight, ancient things, things that were always true, even when they were hidden, even when they were overlooked, even when the tradition tried to move on without them. They were always there. They were always real. And they were always this remarkable. Let their names be the last sound in your mind before sleep comes. Sarah, Hagar, Rebekah, Rachel, Leah, Tamar, Shiphrah and Puah, Miriam, Rahab, Deborah, Jael, Bathsheba, Esther, Vashti, the Queen of Sheba, Abigail, Huldah, Hannah, Anna, Phoebe, Junior, Lydia, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Nazareth, Elizabeth, Martha, Mary of Bethany, the woman at the well, the woman in the crowd, the woman who sent a message in the middle of a trial. All of them, real. All of them, hey, rest now. You are held. Good night.